Hey HOA, Mr. Pandon here. For the next couple of videos, I'm going to be walking through the major events of the U.S. Civil War. Now, I'm not going to be able to cover everything. If you want everything, download the Ken Burns documentary series, which is about 10 hours on the Civil War. I'm going to be hitting the highlights, some major events, and some minor things that kind of illustrate some of the points that we need to be thinking about for our next essay. And those things we need to be thinking about are these questions. Why did the North win the war? Why did it take so long? What role did Abraham Lincoln play in winning the war? How the war changed from being a war to reunite the Union to a war to end slavery. And we're going to also be looking at the role of other countries, both in North America and across the ocean in Europe. What role did they play during the Civil War? Okay, so we're going to start at 1861, where we left off on the last video. Lincoln has been elected. The South is upset about that, and Southern states are seceding from the Union. The ones that are going are the states across the southern tier, the cotton states. So South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas are all going to vote to secede from the Union between December of 1860 and February of 1861. Now, the thinking that's going on there is, from their perspective, they say the states voluntarily joined the Union, and so they have the right to leave. There's nothing in the Constitution that says a state cannot secede, and the 10th Amendment says any power that is not denied to the states is reserved by the states or the people thereof. And so they're saying on that basis, we're perfectly cool. Now, in those states, as they're voting on this question, you got a couple of different groups. You've got sort of the radical secessionists who are referred to as fire eaters. And some of these guys have been trying to get the southern states to secede, all the way back to the nullification crisis. So they really see this as something that the South absolutely must do, that there's no way that the South can continue to survive as part of the Union. You've got another group that is sort of more moderate secessionists. These are guys that weren't really thrilled about secession, but they either saw it as a necessity or they saw it as a political ploy. Some of these guys are thinking, well, we can just bluff and this will be a way to manipulate the political situation to get us some concessions and a new compromise. And that was pretty much what had happened, with the Compromise of 1850 and some of these other things is the northern states sort of gave way to avoid Southern secession. And so there's a sense that some of these guys are sort of playing a political game. There were other people in the South who thought that secession was a really horrible idea, that it would, lead to the Southern states weren't really viable as a country all by themselves, and if they tried to leave, there'd be a war, and that war would be particularly damaging to the South. And so that upper tier of Southern states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, they're slave states, but they initially were not interested in secession. And even in some of the lower tier Southern states, there were voices against secession. It wasn't a unanimous vote by any stretch of the imagination. But once it was approved, those guys mostly conformed to it. They said, all right, there was a vote, majority rule. Rather than sort of leaving the South and becoming refugees in the North, they hung around. And in a lot of cases, the reason they're hanging around is because they know this thing is not going to go very well. And they're hoping that at some point in the future, they will be able to, kind of bring some reasonableness to the situation. But they wouldn't be able to do that if they left or if they, became outspoken opponents of the people's will or that kind of thing. So as politicians, they're kind of trying to maintain their viability. Meanwhile, back in Washington, something is, they're trying to cobble together a compromise. They're trying to do what they had done, Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850. And this guy, Representative John J. Crittenden, from Kentucky. At this point, Henry Clay is dead, but Crittenden is sort of one of his proteges and is kind of taking on this effort. And he proposes 6 amendments to the Constitution, which are basically designed to restore the Missouri Compromise and write it into the Constitution. And then to also, in a number of ways, deny Congress the power to interfere with slavery where it was already legal, and to strengthen the Fugitive Slave Act. And in return for this, and these, by the way, were supposed to be unamendable amendments. Some question legally as to whether that's even possible, but one of the amendments said these amendments can't be amended. So, take that for what it's worth. Crittenden thought this was a deal that everybody could live with, but at this point, the sides are just too far apart. The North had no interest in this. They weren't going to agree to anything that was going to allow slavery to spread. And even if you reinstated the Missouri Compromise, you'd still be talking about territory that didn't have slavery, adopting slavery. Including perhaps future territory south of the border. And the South wouldn't agree to limit the spread of slavery. There was no way they were going to agree to that. And so there's just no way to get the two sides together. The politicians in Washington were interested, but they didn't have any support from the folks at home. And part of this is because, to some extent, both sides think the other side is bluffing. The North doesn't want to cave in to Southern threats. They say, yeah, right, secede. Go ahead, start your own freaking country. See how that's going to work for you. And the South is like, yeah, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to send an army or something? Forget about it. Neither of them are really taking, this seriously as to where this potentially could go, except maybe the fire eaters and the abolitionists. But the folks in the middle, I think, still think this is a political dispute and aren't really looking at it as a military dispute. Now, the southern states, those 7 southern states, one of the first things they do, having declared their independence, is create a new country, which they call the Confederate States of America. And that's that's going to really kind of harden a lot of positions because the new Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, until recently United States Senator from Mississippi, and by the way, a former U.S. Secretary of War during the Mexican War. He had experience. He's a guy who, he wasn't a fire eater. He was one of the more moderate Southerners, but he was, kind of all in on secession at this point. He had hoped to avoid it, but there it is. And he's clear-eyed enough to know that there's probably going to be a war, and it's probably going to be very difficult for the South to win. But there he is. Now that he's sort of running the show for the Southerners, he has taken an oath to support the Confederate States of America and their independence. So he doesn't really have a whole lot of negotiating room at that point. He's willing to negotiate, how to divide the property and that kind of thing, but he's not willing to negotiate on the central issue, which is the divorce. These states starting their own country. And Lincoln is also willing to negotiate on a lot of things, but the one thing he is not willing to negotiate on is secession. He is not going to recognize that these states have left the Union. As far as he's concerned, you can't do that. Lincoln's view was the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution says that you can't leave a state law cannot override the Constitution, which is what put the states in the Union to begin with, and only Congress could release a state, and Congress wasn't doing that. So Lincoln says, you haven't seceded, you're not a country, and I'm not going to treat you like a country. So these two guys are really far apart on the central issue, and they really have no basis for negotiation. This is not something you can split the difference on. This is either or, and either or is a tough thing to compromise. The other thing that happens in Washington, as the states secede, their congressmen and senators resign from Congress and go south, and many of them become senators and congressmen in the new Confederate Congress, which means that the U.S. Congress that's left behind is losing a lot of Democrats, and the Republicans are becoming, getting a bigger and bigger majority, and so Lincoln is going to have a lot of support. If anything, he's going to have, people who are more radical than he is, in pursuing the war. Now, this is all going to come to a head at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. As the states seceded, what happened in most of the states is most of the federal property just got turned over to the state. So, if you're a, U.S. Post Office in, Montgomery, Alabama, the guy who's running the post office in Montgomery, Alabama, is generally speaking a supporter of secession, or he's a guy who does not want a mob to come into his post office and seize the thing. So when, Alabama secedes, he goes out, on his front of the post office, he lowers the U.S. flag, he raises the Confederate flag, and it's now, a Confederate post office. And the same thing with, forts and military installations, lighthouses, any kind of federal property that's in that area. That's pretty much how it's going to go, with a couple of exceptions. And the exception that is most notable is Fort Sumter, South Carolina. If you've ever been to Charleston, South Carolina, and seen Fort Sumter, it sits on an island way out at the mouth of the harbor. And it was built to defend Charleston from a foreign attack, which the assumption was it would probably be the British Navy. So Fort Sumter has a lot of guns, and they are all pointed out to sea. But it's on an island. And the commander of Fort Sumter was not a secessionist. He was a Northerner who just happened to be down there. And he said, I am not going to surrender this place until I get orders from Washington. So this becomes kind of a sticking point. But, it's not a place that a mob is going to be able to overrun. It's out on an island in the harbor. So things are going to be a little dicey. Now, that's the situation when Lincoln takes his oath of office on March the 4th. Remember, this is before the 20th Amendment. And Lincoln says in the tail end of his speech, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, speaking of the South, the Southerners, in your hands and not in mine is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. What he's telling the Southerners is, look, I am not going to shoot first. If this becomes a shooting war, it will be because you guys shot first. And this is pretty sharp on Lincoln's part. He wants the Confederates to be the aggressors. But he also makes another point. He says, you have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I have the most solemn one, which the oath of office, which he has just taken as he's given this speech, to preserve, protect, and defend it. So Lincoln says, look, I'm president of the United States. My job is to, protect federal property, uphold the Constitution, which is basically saying we are not going to hand over Fort Sumter. And, if you guys want it, you're going to have to take it militarily. And if you do, you have started a civil war. You might want to think that over real hard before you do it. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is not sitting idle. Other countries are taking advantage of the preoccupation of the United States. And one place we're going to see that is in the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic had recently freed itself from the domination of Haiti, and a group of people in the Dominican Republic, it's questionable whether they represented the majority of Dominicans, announced that Spanish colonial rule would be restored. DR is going to become part of the Spanish Empire again. Now, this, of course, is a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, but, they don't really think the United States is going to be doing very much about this right now. And this is just the first of a number of developments in the neighborhood that are going to happen as a result of the Civil War. So the South does not, well, they pretty much take Lincoln's dare. They fire on Fort Sumter. And there's a huge amount of cannon fire and drama, which lasts, all night and into the next day. It doesn't actually result in anyone dying. The guys in the fort are pretty much hunkered down. There's not a whole lot they can do about this because their guns are all pointed the other direction. And they're actually in kind of a dangerous position because, of course, the fort was built with the strong side out, the weak side in. So their powder magazine is like right there getting ready to blow up. But they make a diligent effort, and eventually they raise the white flag. Honor has been served, and they leave, turn the fort over to the Confederates. Lincoln now has his war, and he immediately puts out a call for 75,000 volunteers to head south and restore federal authority. He needs to ask for 75,000 volunteers because the United States at this point does not really have a large standing army. It's a relatively small army, and it's mostly guys that are out in the West dealing with Indians. So Lincoln's going to need to raise an army. Now he puts out the call to the governors asking for volunteers. And, the governor of New York gets this message and says, about time, we need to do something about these Southerners. We're tired of their shenanigans. I will send New York's contribution. And the governor of Massachusetts says, about time, let's get this done. And the governor of Ohio and the governor of Indiana and all of these northern state governors are like, all on board. And then what about those 4 southern states? The governor of Virginia says, excuse me, you want what? You want us to send soldiers so that you can, force yourself on a state which has lawfully seceded from the Union? Remember, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, they hadn't left. They had said, we don't want to leave, but we certainly acknowledge that those guys have the right to leave. So Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas are not going to support, and for that matter, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware are not very thrilled about getting involved in this either. Lincoln is, and they understand. I mean, if you're in Virginia and you say he's going to send an army to South Carolina, you understand that that army is probably going to march through Virginia, whether you like it or not. And so those 4 upper tier southern states are going to reconsider and secede from the Union, join the CSA. They're not leaving because Lincoln was elected. They had been perfectly willing to live with Lincoln, but they weren't willing to live with Lincoln using the federal army to, crush state sovereignty. Now, the other 4 slave states, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, their slavery was not as well entrenched. Things were kind of up in the air, and they are not going to secede. In Maryland, things are going to get rather dramatic. In April, Baltimore was kind of a hotbed of secessionist sentiment, and any of those 75,000 soldiers who were coming south and headed to Washington were going to have to go through Baltimore. That's where the railroad terminal was. And when they did, they were frequently attacked by secessionists. There was some riots, people got killed. Very dramatic. The governor of Maryland wasn't thrilled about seceding and persuaded the legislature to not vote to secede, but he's trying to kind of keep Maryland out of it. Well, there isn't any way that Maryland is going to be able to stay out of it. The Union Army is eventually going to occupy Baltimore, impose martial law, arrest anybody who they thought was disloyal, and pretty much, for all intents and purposes, put an army guard on the Maryland legislature so that they wouldn't be inclined to do anything in the direction of secession. Technically, this is probably a violation of the Constitution, but there was no way that they were going to allow Washington to become isolated, a little island of Union capital surrounded by Confederate states. In Kentucky, things weren't quite as dramatic. The Kentuckians also voted down secession while supporting the right of other states to secede. The state government declared neutrality here as well. And here, at least, that neutrality is going to be respected for most of 1861. Neither side wanted to be the first to sort of march into Kentucky. And so that's going to create a little breathing room in the central part of that border between the two warring sides. In Missouri, Missouri got really dramatic. The state government split in two. Governor on one side, part of the state legislature on one side, part of the state legislature on the other side, both pointing fingers at each other and saying, "You're not the real government of Missouri, we are." And they ended up meeting in two separate capitals, and one group joined Missouri to the Confederacy, and the other group said, no, Missouri is still part of the Union. What sort of decides that issue is the presence of the Union Army, which is going to, Union soldiers are going to march into St. Louis, the major city in Missouri, and kind of restore order there, and gradually push the Confederate forces south into Arkansas. So there's going to be a lot of fighting on and off in Missouri, but mostly small stuff, not like the really big battles that are going to be famous. So those border states are going to be a little bit of an issue for Lincoln. They did not secede. They do not want to end slavery. And so for the time being, Lincoln is going to be very careful about making sure that this is a war about ending secession, about bringing those states back into the Union, and that it is not, absolutely positively not, going to be a war to end slavery at this time. Now, as the Union Army, gears up and they have more and more soldiers, it's going to be less and less an issue to worry about the border states. But for most of 1861, the border states are always kind of on Lincoln's mind. So here's where we are. We've got Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas have made their way out of the Union, and the states in yellow are still in it. And we didn't talk about Delaware because, there's like 10 slaves in Delaware and nobody cares. Okay, so the plan that the Union Army is coming up with is formed by General Winfield Scott. He was the, equivalent of, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I didn't call him that then, but he's pretty much in charge of the U.S. military. And Lincoln says, okay, what are we going to do militarily? And Scott comes up with something that becomes called the Anaconda Plan. Because of, it's like this great snake wrapped around the Confederacy and gradually going to squeeze them. Scott says there's basically three parts to this. Part one is a naval blockade, which will cut the South off from trade with other countries. They don't produce a lot of the stuff that they're going to need to mount a war. They don't, they have very little manufacturing. They're not going to be able to produce a lot of guns and ammunition and that kind of thing. And they're even going to be hurting probably for food and stuff like that. You know, cotton is their main export. If the cotton doesn't get out and other goods don't get in, they can't eat cotton, they can't shoot cotton. And so that's going to put a damper on the situation. Then the other part of the Anaconda Plan is take possession of the Mississippi River. You take possession of the Mississippi River, you cut the South in two. And because a lot of their food production is west of the Mississippi in Texas, cut that off from the eastern part, you're going to put even more pressure on them. And then once that's all accomplished, you can gradually sort of squeeze the snake and eventually bring them to heel. Now, part of what Scott's thinking about here is he's actually thinking about, okay, what happens after this? We don't want to have a scorched earth policy because at some point, these people are going to have to be returned to loyalty to the Union. And the general thinking in Washington was the vast majority of Southerners were perfectly happy to be Americans. And it was only this small group of radical fire eaters who were probably bluffing who had kind of arranged this whole thing. And if you just sort of start putting a little pressure on them, eventually those the citizens of the South will rise up and overthrow these guys and be begging to get back into the Union. That's kind of the thinking of this. A lot of people didn't like the Anaconda Plan because they said, oh my goodness, this is going to take a very long time. Why don't we just, march down to Richmond and hang a few people and be done with it? We'll see how that goes. But the Anaconda Plan is actually going to be how this thing ends up going. The South actually kind of helped this process by making a key mistake. Okay, so Lincoln has ordered this blockade so that no trade can go from the southern states to Europe. The problem is the Navy isn't really that big, and it's not really set up to do this. It's going to take some time to get enough ships in position to be able to actually enforce this. So at the time that Lincoln announces this blockade, there's not really much to it. Had the South just sort of ignored the blockade and continued to trade with Britain, they could have been stocking up a lot of supplies. They had a lot of cotton they could sell that the British wanted to buy, and the British could pay for that in weapons and supplies, food, all kinds of things that they were going to need. But that's not going to happen because what the Southerners decided was what they really wanted from the Europeans was not just money and supplies. They wanted them to intervene, to force Lincoln to cave into their demands. And they thought the best way to get their attention would be to cut off cotton. They assumed that British merchants were so dependent on cotton that if it was cut off, they would run screaming to Parliament and force the British to do something. What they didn't fully appreciate was British merchants are not stupid. And all through the 1850s, it had been increasingly obvious that something was going to happen in the United States that might interfere with cotton. So they had bought extra cotton and stockpiled it. And they had also investigated other places where they could get cotton, like Egypt and India. The cotton wasn't quite of as high a quality, but it certainly was there and certainly was available. And so they made a lot of cotton cloth in 1859 and 1860, and then they figured they would just sort of ride out this temporary disruption, thinking that the war, again, how long can this war possibly last? It'll be over in a couple of months, and there you go. So here's kind of the cartoon. You've got on the right the Americans fighting it out, and John Bull, the British character in the center, says, well, if you're going to fight and not do business, I'll go to the other shop where the Indian merchant is perfectly happy to sell him cotton. All right, from London, if you're looking at this from the outside as a different perspective, London has to make a choice. And it is pretty much going to be London, because London at this point is the leading country in the world, certainly in Europe, having emerged victorious from the Napoleonic Wars. And, you know, as London goes, so pretty much is going to go everybody else. Now, on the side of supporting the Confederates, you know, there's the cotton thing. There's also this issue that Lincoln's blockade technically is a violation of international law. Under the international law that was recognized at the time, you could only impose a blockade on a foreign country. And so Lincoln is trying to kind of have his cake and eat it too. He says the South is not a foreign country, but we are going to blockade them. The rules under international law is kind of all of your, you can't close some of your ports to international trade by you know, military force. If we're allowed to trade, we're allowed to trade. If we're not allowed to trade, we're not allowed to trade. There's also a certain amount of affinity between the British nobility and you know, the Southern planter class. They all both have kind of a feudalistic view of the world. They like to, you know, sit in their mansion and watch other people do work for them. And there's the whole business of, you know, the United States, the British Empire didn't really want the United States to be too strong. They had concerns that the U.S. was becoming wealthier and more powerful, and in the long run, you know, if you could cut them down to size, that might be good for the British Empire. But on the other side, you know, cotton wasn't necessarily the be-all and end-all. And the British Empire, you know, they're a little, they're not thrilled about this whole idea of a portion of a country declaring independence and running off. They've got a lot of places in their empire that might want to do exactly that. And, you know, whether it's Scotland or Ireland or India or Canada, they don't want to set a precedent there. You know, that whole business of unilateral declarations of independence, they hadn't liked it very much in 1776, and they still don't. They also, while the British nobility was in tune with the South, Britain is, you know, more or less a democracy at this point, and they have to be worried about working class British voters. And working class British voters did not like slavery. Thanks to the efforts of William Wilberforce, the British were really down on slavery. There's also the question of, you know, if we get into a war with the U.S., is that something we really want to do? I mean, we've got our colony of Canada just sort of hanging over there without a huge standing army or a whole lot of ability to defend itself. Do we really want to go down that road? And so this debate is going to be going on in London for the next couple of years. It's going to eventually fall on the side of, you know, let's not get too involved, but that's not going to be obvious in 1861. What they do in 1861 is Queen Victoria, on behalf of the British government, issues a Declaration of Neutrality. Now, the Declaration of Neutrality says British subjects are forbidden from providing arms to either side. And this is kind of a win for Lincoln because, you know, the North is perfectly capable of producing its own arms. The South is not. Now, this is a government declaration. British subjects certainly, you know, have the option of violating the law and doing things, you know, on the sly. And there's going to be a fair amount of that going on. But at least officially, the British government has directed that nobody support either side. But Lincoln doesn't get everything he wants. They do recognize the Confederate States of America as a belligerent power, which is a notch up from being pirates, so that you know, they're not going to be treated as criminals. They are going to have certain rights in Britain The British are not going to extradite, Confederate representatives from England. They're not going to, track down Confederate ships as pirate ships. They're going to recognize them as a legitimate belligerent, but not as a legitimate government. They're not going to exchange ambassadors and, full recognition. It's going to be sort of this, halfway house. It's somewhat encouraging to the Confederates, but, Jefferson Davis was hoping for more. Lincoln was hoping for less. So, the Brits are kind of splitting the difference and waiting to see how things go. Another development that's going to be significant is around about May, General Benjamin Butler, who's in command of Fort Monroe. Fort Monroe is down at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. It's a similar situation to Fort Sumter. It's under federal control, but, kind of surrounded by hostility. Runaway slaves start showing up at Fort Monroe. And General Butler has the question of what's he going to do with them? According to the old rules, Fugitive Slave Act, they would be returned to their owners. But Butler says that's insane. Why would we want to give more power to these guys who are fighting against us? So he declares these slaves contraband of war. Under sort of the laws of war, when you're in a conflict, you don't have to return the enemy's property when it falls into your hands, especially when that property can be used for military purposes. And so by that logic, Butler says, we're not turning the slaves back. The ones that didn't stay in the fort and be put to work there got resettled elsewhere. But they're not going to be returned. And Lincoln was a little concerned about this, but he followed Butler's logic and said, all right, this is cool. The slaves are still slaves. They're still property. They're just owned by the federal government now. And that's the situation when we get to the first major battle of the war, which the Union calls the First Battle of Bull Run, because the Union tended to name their battles after the nearest waterway. And the Confederates call the First Battle of Manassas because they name their battles after the nearest town. So this is, you probably know where Manassas is. It's about, maybe 40 miles or so outside of Washington, just past what's now Dulles Airport. Of course, Dulles Airport then. And it's on the rail line that goes from Washington to Richmond. And the logic here is, okay, there's a bunch of crazies doing things in Richmond. Let's send a big freaking army down there and slap them around and be done with this. So you've got two armies, a Union army that's trying to head down to Richmond and a Confederate army, which has been sort of cobbled together just as quickly as the Union army, which is going to stop them. Even though the Union has more soldiers, offense is more difficult than defense. The Confederates managed to defeat the Union army, and they, have this pell-mell retreat back to Washington. And this is kind of sending a message to everybody that this is not going to be as easy as you thought it was. This is going to be difficult. And that is going to be the beginnings of this guy, George McClellan, who had some success in the western part of Virginia, which I will cover later. He is put in command of this army that has now had this major loss. And his job is, okay, these guys are going to have some real training, and they're going to need to know what they're doing. He is going to spend pretty much the next year training and equipping this army so that it is 100% ready to take on the Confederates. Now, McClellan is going to get a reputation of being, sort of unwilling to commit his forces. But you have to remember, he's coming from his perspective, okay, we tried that and it didn't work. And we need to do this, carefully and cautiously and according to the military book. Meanwhile, Congress is in action. In August, Congress is going to pass what they call the First Confiscation Act. And this is basically, making it official what Butler had already been doing, which is Congress authorizes the seizure of any property, and property includes slaves, used to support the rebellion. So if a slave is being used in any way to support the rebellion, digging trenches, helping to build forts, moving military supplies, anything like that, they can be seized and they will become property of the U.S. government. And their status after the war will be sorted out after the war. So pretty much the young, strong men who are able to do work are going to be put to work for the army. Anybody else is going to be settled in some kind of a camp where they can pretty much be refugees and figure out some way to feed themselves. Abolitionists from the North are going to jump on these camps like nobody's business because they want to help these. Technically, these are not freed slaves, but as far as the abolitionists are concerned, they are headed in that direction. And so they're, opening schools, teaching children how to read, making sure people have enough food and supplies, and, so they can get as much independence as they can so that, this freedom, this rather tenuous freedom that they have will become permanent. We're not going to have a whole lot more sort of Army action because, the Army is busy training, but the Navy is going to get into action, sort of implementing the Anaconda Plan. And part of that is going to be seizing some bases on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And they're going to, this area was largely undefended by the Confederates. They're stretched pretty thin. And they don't have enough men to defend all of their borders. So forts are going to be established here, and those forts, the more forts you have in the South, the more runaway slaves are going to show up because the slaves are pretty much freeing themselves whenever they have an opportunity. That's more contrabands. And so we're going to be getting more and more of those contrabands in the mix. And this is when we get an episode that has gone down in history as the Trent Affair. November 1861, these two guys, John Mason, grandson of George Mason, the guy the university is named after, and John Slidell, they were going to be representatives from the Confederate government. Mason was going to London, Slidell was going to Paris, to attempt to get formal recognition. They got on a small ship that kind of smuggled them down to Cuba. And then once they were in Cuba, which is, not U.S. territory, they could kind of openly book passage on a British steamer and head to London. Captain Charles Wilkes there gets word of this, and he decides to intercept that British ship, the Trent, and force them to heave to. The Trent is a civilian ship. They don't have weapons, even though they are pretty much outraged that the United States is violating the rights of the British flag. This is a violation of international law, and the Brits are very annoyed about it. They send Captain Wilkes seizes Mason and Slidell and hauls them off to be imprisoned in New York. Lincoln gets a very stiffly worded letter from the British that says, you will allow those men to go on their way, or you will have to deal with, a war with Britain. Were the British bluffing? Possibly. Did Lincoln want to take that chance? No, definitely not. Lincoln, despite the fact that, it's going to cost him a little in public opinion, because there's not a whole lot of love in the United States for the British, he's going to turn these guys in and let the British have them. Now, as it turns out, when they get to London and Paris, they're going to have absolutely no success in their mission. So in some ways, maybe this is all just sort of play acting on the part of the British and on the part of Lincoln to sort of, handle the diplomatic niceties, but not actually give the Confederates any real advantage. But this is probably as close as the United States and Britain ever came to, being in conflict and the British intervening in the war. It's entirely possible that the British never had any intention of intervening, but this is certainly as close as it's going to get. Meanwhile, the French are invading Mexico, a similar situation to what we saw in the Dominican Republic. Mexico had been going through a whole lot of drama since getting independence from Spain. The royalist side had lost the most recent civil war, and so they invite the French to come in and invade the place. President Juarez, representing sort of the more democratic classes and elements in Mexico, he's going to end up retreating to the north, and all of this is going to be enabled because the United States is busy. So the French are looking to take advantage of the preoccupation of the United States. And it's going to be kind of in the interest of France for the United States to be preoccupied as long as possible. So when we get to the end of 1861, this is kind of the map. Those sort of dark green areas are either mountains or desert, which are not really, open to military activity. But if you look here, I mean, the Confederates at the end of 1861 still hold the bulk of their territory. The Union hasn't made any major inroads. In fact, there's portions of the border states that are more or less under Confederate control. So in terms of the map, things are looking pretty good. What's not looking so good is the numbers. By the end of 1861, the Union Army is up to 661,000 men who are rapidly training and getting ready for 1862. The Confederates have got 202,000, so they're outnumbered across the board 3-1. Now, the Confederates are on defense, so, that gives them some advantages. It's easier to do defense than to do offense. But clearly, this is not a situation that's going to be great for the Confederacy at the end of 1861. And, in the next video, we'll take a look at 1862. So until then, hope you enjoyed this and be ready for a quiz.